Before we dive into this episode, most business owners we find struggle with time management, cash flow, and actually scaling their business. We really feel like we have to work this out on our own. This isn't really the case. We built Invizifi, and this is a way that we can help you achieve those outcomes in your business for free. So check out the show notes below, click on the link, and see how we can help you through Invizifi build and scale your business, which becomes your ideal business. Okay, this subject's a really interesting one. It's something that can have such a big impact on your life, you know. And this is really interesting, but you know, if you implement this process when you're looking at making any sort of decision, it will definitely, without a doubt, deliver better outcomes and better decisions, and avoid making decisions that might not be best. And I'm just going to go through and explain. This is a key philosophy that I have. It's more understanding with this one simple step why it is important and how it can really impact on the decisions that you make and the outcomes that flow from those decisions. And I think I might start this by talking about choice. The challenge today, compared to say 10 or 15 years ago, is the amount of choice that's available for pretty much everything and anything you can think of, right? Anything and everything you can think of, the amount of choice. So just, you know, because now we're a web-based economy, we've got apps for everything, you know, when you're looking at traveling, accommodation, how you book flights, when you're looking at places to go, decisions about the food to order. If you look at anything today compared to 10 or 15 years ago, the amount of choice has exploded, right? And look, there's some real positives relating to having that amount of choice. It can be a really positive thing, but it can also be a bit of a problem. And I'm going to explain why I believe that to be the case. I'll give you an example. When we started ResiCert over 15 years ago, we needed an automation platform, a system. Really at that point in time, there was only 2 or 3 that really did what we needed to do. 2 or 3 different applications, right? And I've mentioned it before, I use a particular application called Entreport, which we've used for many, many, many years now. But there was only 2 or 3 that really did what we needed to do. Fast forward to today, there's so many different choices. And some do this, and some do that, and some do a little bit of this, and that, and the other. And that's one example. I can give you many examples in business where it's becoming really challenging, because the number of choices exploded. And you would think that's a really good thing because you've got more to choose from. The problem is that making a decision then gets, you know, it's directly proportional to the amount of choice. And so one of the tools that I'd really encourage anyone to use is to sort of put this step into place, this process into place, which will eliminate the unfortunate outcome of making the wrong choice, which is a decision often has not one, not this, not that, but obviously has many options. So you can go down different paths, you've got many different options to pick through. So what simple step can you implement which will always lead to better decisions, better outcomes? Toothpaste. Why is toothpaste important in this subject? I don't go to the supermarket very often. One of the reasons is there's too much choice for so many things. Next time, if you go to the supermarket, if you've been to the supermarket recently, you probably understand what I'm saying. When you go to look at toothpaste, it's always astounded me how much choice and how many different types of toothpaste there is. You would think something you squeeze onto a toothbrush and you brush your teeth with is toothpaste. You know, effectively all the toothpaste has to achieve the same, pretty much every single type of toothpaste achieves the same outcome. That's what it does. You put on a toothpaste, on a toothbrush, and you brush your teeth. Most supermarkets have, you know, 4 or 5 shelves, and it's 4 or 5 meters wide, and there's toothpaste, so much toothpaste. I remember standing in front of it one day. This single step makes it really easy when I buy toothpaste. And this step is about introducing a constraint or more constraints. So the more constraints that you have, the more non-negotiables in relation to the decision, the better the decision will be and the easier the decision will be. So for example, I don't use any toothpaste that has sodium lauryl sulfate, SLS. It's basically, we don't think toothpaste works unless it foams, it sort of foams up, because we've been conditioned to believe that if it's not foaming, it's not really cleaning, the same with soap. And sodium lauryl sulfate, it's not a great additive, and it's a foaming agent. It's not very nice. And the vast majority of toothpaste have sodium lauryl sulfate. Check it out next time you look at a tube of toothpaste. So one constraint, very simple for me, is I don't use toothpaste that has sodium lauryl sulfate. So with that one decision, it wipes out the vast majority of toothpaste. And because people don't really buy this type of toothpaste, it's always on the bottom shelf and there's 3 or 4 options. So then I just tend to look at the 3 or 4 options. So I'm standing there in front of the toothpaste, red, white, blues, I go, okay, I know the ones that don't, because I go down the bottom and there's 3 or 4, and then I've got a choice of 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. Maybe what's on special, or I don't really mind. So that's an example of making wiping out choices with one simple constraint. And that's the step that I would encourage you to do, is think about constraints, not as a negative thing, because often we're taught, oh, don't constrain things, you're limiting the possibilities, you can get that way of thinking. But actually, when you're looking at making decisions, constraints are really, really good. They're a really good thing, because it makes a lot of decision making much, much easier. And you'd be surprised at the outcomes that come from that. So the toothpaste is really, really pertinent. What I want to do is just share a little bit more information about Invizifi, which I mentioned at the start of this podcast. As you know, this podcast is all about helping people build their ideal business. Now, if you want a structured plan and a process to do that, then you really need to check out Invizifi. Invizifi provides the end-to-end solution for someone to build, operate, and actually be able to extract from their business. And how does it do that? Well, it has a whole range of different components. Firstly, it's a philosophy and a strategy. Getting the philosophy and the strategy right at the beginning, and that really focuses on why are you in business? What sort of life do you want to achieve? What's your ideal life look like? This is the absolute start point, and we call that the foundations. From there, we've got detailed training in every part of the business, not just training, but actually the tools, the framework, and the checklists, so that you can apply the training in a practical sense. So you can actually implement and have it make a difference to the way that you structure your business. What I've found over the years is there's lots of training and information on what you should do, but how you go about doing it is what's lacking. And that's what we really wanted to identify and create, was the how. So check out Invizifi. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can find out how to apply this approach to you, your business, which will help you move towards an ideal life through creating an ideal business. Check out the link in the show notes. And the best part is it's free to get going and check out what's on offer. Do it today. Where else? And I'm going to give you some examples of, introducing constraints that I've used that enabled me to make better choices, end up with better decisions. We have cars. I've got a few cars. Got some Russian cars, some Italian cars, some English cars. I do enjoy my vehicles. And I've got one constraint that I use when I buy cars. Most of them are old cars. I like old cars. Still very old school, so I like cars that are manual. Most of my cars, none of my cars are automatic. Most of them have wind-up windows. If I'm lucky, they've got an air conditioner. I've got a few cars here in Australia and a few in Italy. But there's one particular constraint that I always use when I'm buying a second-hand car, and it's the number of kilometres. It's very simple. So, what I did, and I'll give you the example, I've got a few Land Rovers. I like Land Rovers because we spend half the year in Italy, half the year in Australia. I wanted a Land Rover. And so a couple of years ago, I bought a Land Rover in Europe. And as you can appreciate, lots of Land Rovers. I wanted a short wheelbase 90, lots of Land Rovers to choose from. And I remember before we'd headed on this trip, it's been a couple of years now, going into an app that has cars in Europe, Land Rovers. I was pretty particular about I had the brand, I know it's a Land Rover, and there was a couple of years, so I introduced a constraint You know, it was going to be from 2000, 2003. There's a particular type of Land Rover. And then the other constraint that I put in place was no more than 50,000 kilometres. Now that sounds ridiculous when you think about it, because this is a car that, you know, at that time was over 20 years old, but no more than 50,000 kilometres. And so you can imagine that I input that in, and the choice goes from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds to 10. So very quickly, because that's, you know, why do I make that choice? An older car with low kilometres is obviously going to be much better condition. You might pay a bit extra for it, but also it once again limits the amount of choice. And there was actually, when I did that search, I still remember there was one particular car that came up. It was the car that I own now. It was the first car I looked at, which is quite interesting. It was in Germany, and it was a 2002 vehicle, 20 years old, and it had 38,000 kilometres. And it had other things that I needed with it. And so I remember when we landed in Germany, when I looked at it, it ticked all the boxes, and I ended up buying that car. And it was really easy because there were so many cars I could have spent ages, months and months looking. But that one constraint which I use, and I've done that with most of my vehicles. So that's another form of a constraint that I use when making decisions in relation to cars. Another area with constraints, constraint is when you're looking at property. Because at the moment we do a lot of property investment, property development. As I probably mentioned, that we bought a property in Italy. We spent a bit of time in Italy now. We came up with a range of constraints for the property, and that's something that I'd really recommend. That, you know, when people are looking at buying a property, they're always looking at the investment and this and that, and I get in the area and blah, 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 blah. I get all that. But actually what you need, again, is a set of constraints which will limit the choice in the marketplace. And those constraints are typically linked to the specific outcomes of what you want from a particular decision. So the constraint leads to less choice, but leads to a more refined and a decision that's more likely to deliver what it is that you want particularly. And we're all different, you know, that's something that we're all different. So there's no perfect set of constraints. There was specific things. We wanted a certain size of land, and there had to be minimum size of the house, and we wanted to be close to a village, and anyway, there was I think we had about 15 particular items that were effective constraints. And when we started the process, it was a couple of years ago, looking for a house in Italy, it made it very simple, because as you can, if you're not aware, there's a lot of properties for sale in Italy, and buying property in Italy can be a bit of a minefield. It's very cost effective, you know, compared to, for example, Australia. But you can actually end up with the wrong property, making a poor decision. And so we're very particular, and in the process of looking at property, it was very easy to say no, not even going and looking, because it just didn't tick the boxes. And so I tend to be very non-negotiable with my constraints. When I've made a set of constraints, that's it. I know, and there's something that happens when you do this, you know it's the right decision. As for example, we knew it was the right property because it pretty much ticked every box. And it was pretty much the only property which we looked at that ticked every box. And we didn't look at a lot of properties. We landed in Italy, we sort of identified the zone. I think we spent 10 days looking at property. The first property that I found on the internet was actually the house we bought, because it ticked all the boxes. And then we did, over the period of that week, look at, I don't know, 10 or 15 houses, but none of them even came close. And we ended up buying that particular house. But those constraints made it very easy and eliminated the choice significantly. As a result, we've had that house now for over a year. It's been fabulous. It actually has met, you know, the constraints that we introduced were the things that we wanted from it. It's actually made it ideal, and it feels like a home away from home. It's like a second home. So that's an example of, another example how you can use a constraint, which is that simple step, which can make better decisions, help you make better decisions in a world of ultimate choice. And so that's something that, it's just a philosophy, and it can be something simple, you know, like with the car, it's kilometres, you know, with property, there's obviously a few more things you can add. But if there's anything, anytime you're wanting to make a decision, I always look at what can I put into play to reduce the choice. I'm not a lover of a lot of choice, you know. I remember probably the funniest constraint that I did once was it's pretty silly. I wanted to get a new TV. I walked into a local retailer here in Australia, and he says, "Oh, you're after TV?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said to me, "What sort of TV you want?" And what I said to him is, "I want the biggest TV you have that is the most heavily discounted." And he sort of laughed. He said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, that's what I want. I want the biggest, flashiest TV that is the most heavily discounted on sale." Because I didn't really have anything specific. So I was after a TV that was hopefully a really good TV, but was on real special. And when you go into retailers, you can see there's tons of TVs. And he went, "Okay, well, this will be this TV." So he walked me over to this particular TV. I can't remember what it was, but it was something like less than half price, because it was the end of line and there was something special on it. And it was a huge TV. And I looked at it and went, okay, and looked at the reviews and went, fine. And that was a TV I bought. Because when you look at TVs nowadays, again, too much choice. So by having that criteria, which was a pretty strange set of criteria, because they all do the same thing. I wanted it's a high quality TV, but I wasn't prepared to pay the high quality price for it. And so I managed to ask the right question. So that constraint, delivers a really good outcome in relation to both price and quality, which is really interesting. So I would really encourage you. It becomes a way of approaching things and making decisions. I use it pretty much all the time in anything that I do. Always look at constraints as a really positive thing. And for me personally, I always look at the decisions which unfold, or the choices that end up always becoming better with this simple step of introducing constraints. One constraint or multiple constraints just makes it so much easier in a world full of choice. Thanks for joining me on this podcast, and all the very best, and I'll look forward to catching up with you in the next episode of the Ideal Business Podcast. Ciao for now. If you enjoyed today's podcast, then I recommend for you to check something out. I've written a book called Building Your Ideal Business, Live Your Ideal Life. So much of the content in this podcast has sort of come from the framework of that book, and also the Invizifi platform, which I've mentioned before. Much of that content has come from this book as well. So if you've enjoyed the podcast and you want to find out more, please check it out. Look in the show notes. It's currently available on Amazon, and let me know what you think.